There we go. All right, well, thanks everybody for joining the weekly Dalton Collective Hangout. Today I wanted to go over the reason for being again. Like, what is Dalton here for? So the kind of the three things that I typically tend to repeat on these weekly meetings is we're here for fellowship. And the group is the most important part of this whole organization. We're here to be sustainable, so that means profitability. We're going to do something in order to generate income and wealth for ourselves. And we're going to do this on our own terms. We're going to do this in a way that gives us the independence that we need to do this. Sovereignty is another word for it, something like that. But why would we want to do that? Like, why is that even important in the first place? Well, there's some differences to this particular approach from other approaches that do some of the same things. Social groups, friend groups, they're all groups that are focused on the group itself and the individuals, but they don't make money typically. And then the groups that are focused on making money don't necessarily care about the relationships themselves, or at least they're secondary to the profit motive. So that's one thing. The independence or the doing things the way we want to do them kind of slides or has a scale across those two different organizations the same. In some environments, it's really hard to get things done, like say in a very regulated environment. Pick any regulated environment, there needs to be a lot of things that you need to go through in order to make money or make a profit. Or in some other places where you're just playing a game of cards or whatever, there's no regulation at all, it's just having fun. Okay. But zooming out on a larger perspective to our wider culture and society, I've been thinking about lately, given all of the sort of rapid cultural changes that seem to be happening all around us, if groups like Dalton, or at least groups that are thinking about new ways of organizing, are exploring the boundaries or exploring the frontier of what human collaboration is and what it might even look like. So that's a bit abstract, and I don't have a lot of great words for it, but there's really two ways in which I think the sort of near-term cultural landscape might sort of change. One is that it's some basic, maybe not basic, but it's a change from one way of doing things to a new way of doing things. So an example of some cultural shift in the past way of organizing is, several hundred years ago, society and countries were sort of organized by religion. The religions would sort of gather the groups together and point them in one particular direction, and that was the organizing principle. And then that changed into something what we have today, more or less, which is sort of like the nation state is the organizing government, is the organizing principle of large societal groups. And that's one way, the one example of shift. But it's potentially that we're on the cusp of something different than that. What it specifically is, I'm not sure, and I don't know that anybody can be particularly sure because it's not here yet. And the only reason I think that might be possible is really because of the internet. Like the internet being if it's fundamentally different than how humans coordinated under those prior regimes, then it might be possible for different kinds of coordination to happen on a very, very large scale. Now, that doesn't mean necessarily Dalton or things like it would grow to the size of a society where it's like, that's the way we do things. But the pattern of exploring either environmental niches of organization to figure out what works is kind of where I'm going with that. And I'm wondering in my head, okay, we as a group are trying something out. How are we going to know if we're succeeding at what we're trying to do? Is this something that can be replicated far and wide, so to speak? And how would we know if we even got there? So one thing, or a few things that I've been thinking about in terms of like how to recognize whether a Dalton is being successful or not. There's some sort of gut metrics that I can sort of experience in a sort of a trajectory, like how many people show up to any given meeting or any given like work section, something like that. That's an indicator. How interested are people in what it is that we're trying to do? Okay, that's a different thing. More concretely, Like, are we actually able to make money? Are we actually growing an asset base that gives us like sort of like insurance or backup in case cash flows run low? Or the processes that we've been thinking about and potentially putting in place for conflict resolution actually going to work? Is the group going to hold together? Can we keep the band together? All of those things have kind of been floating around in my head when it comes to Dalten and what it is that we're doing, what we're trying to do, and how we're going to do it, and what other people are probably going to be trying out, and in which contexts, meaning where are they going to be trying to do this? And I think the internet specifically is an interesting environment to play around in. Far less friction in a lot of ways. So that's what I had for today is just sort of a thought experiment. And practically for this group, I'd like to ask what do you think we should be looking at in terms of like judging our own success? Meaning, is this group working? And if it's not, what can we do to either reorient or do differently or anything else like that? So with the rest of the time that we're going to have like on the recorded session, we'll just go with that question. How are we doing as a group? Is this working? If yes, what can we do more? And if no, what should we maybe look at changing? So I'll open up the floor to anybody who wants to give an opinion.
So, hard for me to say yet, I think, because this is the second meeting, and
Sure.
Well, success is always measured by your goals divided by what you've done, right? In some sense, right? And I think maybe we're still in the process of determining those goals, right? I mean, I know it's supposed to be for profit and so on. So that's one way of measuring success, right? The amount of profit generated. And the other obvious way of measuring success is the engagement, from the, how many people come to meetings and so on. Right now, I think we have a good number.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say fairly successful in terms of engagement. I mean, those are two very sort of general things. But I don't think I can say much more because, I haven't been very involved so far. So that's it from me, I think.
Thanks, Phonics. I appreciate it. I guess the one thing I can say in terms of, I mean, Dalten is not exactly profitable, but it does own a star, which is worth, depending on what you can get on the open market, a few $1,000s at least. And to date, I don't think there are any expenses. So I think that does mean it's profitable so far, which is good.
Yes, thanks to a generous gift from someone.
Yes. Yes. And from you, Sarpan, since you've probably had some of the most experience with groups of this type, how would it compare to some of the other groups that you've been a part of?
I mean, I haven't been part of too many. There was, I mean, D-Org has, kind of its own objectives that are, a route that we could go was not necessarily the same. But it's not exactly explicitly profit-oriented. It's kind of like most of the revenue that we generate ends up going back into like funding projects that we're interested in. One's kind of like this, there's a few names going around like Web3 API or something, but details don't matter so much. But it's an interesting project, I mean, I mean, there's another that I was a part of that I dare not mention because of hectic elements to it. But I mean, I can say that that organization had its hands on a lot more resources.
Yeah.
And had a lot more people. But you know, outside of like, you know, I guess the friends that we made along the way, you know, it's hard to ascribe it success. But what I can say is like, you know, if that's like, you know, ultimately like, you know, in the worst case scenario for the most part, I see Dalton as like something like that, you know, which, you know, we can like put people together, help people realize their potential in various ways, even if it's not like, you know, coming out of like profit generated by Dalton or whatever, but like something else, you know. I mean, I would already say that that's like, you know, a success, you know, and it's like a success of like that is like I think parallels success of various sorts of like you know like fellowships, societies, fraternal organizations, and so on. Um, yeah, I guess that's sort of maybe is my 2 cents.
Yeah, and there's also a lot to be learned in things that don't work, right? So I learned a lot from that particular project as well, like a lot, which is mostly that, you know, I came out of the Ethereum space where the decentralized autonomous organization is very much still a term that has a lot of positive connotation. It's a term that a lot of people think they understand or think they have some idea about what it means, maybe even practiced some of it, but I don't think a DAO means leaderless, or if it is, then it's, you know, not good. And if you're trying to experiment with governance models where nobody is in charge, there's a lot of pitfalls there. Like, not saying don't try, don't experiment. Certainly do, but I have done a few experiments in this sort of vein, and I think collective is the right approach. In that it says something about ownership. It says something about the ability of each one of us to be a fractal part of a whole. I think that's what we're talking about in Dalton. Not there's nobody in charge. Like, there is somebody in charge. Like, I'm in charge. Right? And it's not like you do what I say, because that's also not leadership. Leadership is a servant's act, in my opinion. Right? It's my job as the leader of this group is to make sure that it's successful in all the ways that I can make it successful. And that also requires a bit more from me. But I also don't think that means I should have an outsized take on the profits either. Like, it's just a different role. Yeah. But distributed, which is different than decentralized, is actually really important too. Like, that has its own properties, of which I think is really important. Like, we don't have to be in the same place. In fact, we have advantages by not being in the same place. Some disadvantages too.
I mean, an interesting part, I think, of like one, like the sort of function of like fellowship or like network, like in conjunction with like leadership and so on. And in terms of like sort of like, I mean, I think like one is that like the sort of, you know, looseness, like, and which we can formalize looseness in terms of membership and so on, and being a network is like something worth preserving because it allows you to like,
Yeah.
you know, continuously like sort of like like capture or like bring in like elements of people and different things going on, which like, somewhat like organically and sometimes not so organically because it's like, oh, this is something that can happen. So let's try to get this to happen, sort of like becomes possible. And like, I mean, I've mentioned this before, I think, in other calls, but like the and it seems to me like it's almost like so I one of the at the organization which shall not be named, we we had some good ideas, especially sort of my sort of cabal of people. I think were like on like sort of like saw better what was happening and like what was going on and contextualize it. No, that wasn't that one.
Oh, a different one? Okay, never mind.
Yeah. I told you before,
Okay. Yeah.
but the let's see, the like there was like this sort of like maybe like organization network difference that sort of but like also like network kind of is like maybe protocol, or maybe like there's normative aspects to it, and like not in any strict sense, but in terms of like just like basic framework for being able to like posit goals and like synthesize new collective agencies, like inside the network topology or something. And then so like the organization could be seen as kind of like a first instance, and like the leadership here, I think, sort of like properly situated is like there's a few different notions here. One would be like at the level of like these individual sort of agencies or orgs that are sort of within like the network or fellowship, and like that leadership is like way more like sort of explicit, like in terms of like like this organization like has decided that like this is like the structure of the operating and like this person's in charge, or this is how we dethrone him or whatever, but then there's also like maybe the more general, which is somewhat more like leadership, more like diplomacy or something, because like I think like another important element here, like in order to like both sort of in emphasizing the network bit and like sort of like tolerating like the sort of like heterogeneity and like autonomy of the different like organizations or agencies within it, there is like like the possibility I mean you could build like an organization on top of other organizations, say, like just very sort of simply, like that, like, or, a spin-off project where, multiple agencies in this network maybe contribute resources, be that monetary, labor, address space, assets, whatever, and there it's kind of like where leadership plays a role is like it's not as explicit as like at the individual level or at the like individual agency level, but it's like it's more like like who has like their sights on, I guess you might call it sort of like collective intelligence, or like like being like sort of keenly aware of like the different happenings and being able to like like see an opportunity where like like different people, different agencies, different sort of connections can sort of like if so like somebody's like aware to pinpoint there's like a possibility there and they do so, they can like bridge that gap and like cause either like, you know, people to shuffle around into different agencies, create a new one that's like separate from them, or like synthetic out of like the different pieces and so on.
Yeah, and the way I've kind of thought about it when as you were talking there, Sarpin, is there's a difference in quantity and quality of things. So sometimes an additional quantity makes something special, and sometimes its quality makes it special. So if we look at something like the way,
Just briefly, I would say like maybe quantity benefits the network, and then quality benefits like the individual agencies, and also like those who like take upon themselves the stewardship of like the network. But anyway, go on. Sorry.
yeah. Well, talking about a network as opposed to an organization, that's also a difference of quality or kind, not necessarily like goodness or whatever, and amount. So you might have a very large company, right, that might have a lot of power, and you have a very small network that has equal sets of either, you know, call it whatever you will, power, authority, influence, something like that. But one, they achieve their ends through numbers, and the other through structure or something. This is where my mind is thinking. And maybe that is also what I've been thinking about in terms of Dalten, is not necessarily just Dalten itself, but how does Dalten fit into a network? And what are the properties of that particular network, as opposed to the properties of the sort of the culture and society that we live in now? Maybe they're different, maybe they're not, but I have an intuition that they could be.
Yeah, I think you're definitely right there. You know, I think there's also sort of like, I mean, touches upon various like maybe like fundamentals of like, I'm gonna say like the fundamentals of like what Urbit can do, but like, you know, like a key part of its development. You know, I mean, I think like, you know, I think it's, you know, both valuable for the ecosystem of Urbit, and also valuable in terms of like maybe like the power obtained by like an organization which sort of facilitates like interorganizational exchange.
Mm-hmm.
And like, so I mean, very simply, just, you know, like I think maybe like, you know, the star experiment that you're doing, you know, like, but like one is like, you know, I think that's good for Urbit, but our proximity to that is also good for Dalton.
Mm-hmm.
You know, because we're sort of like, we have tentacles, so to speak, you know, within the Urbit ecosystem, and those tentacles are worth growing.
And we have some level of reputation, right? Like, people know who we are. Like, it's a household name in the Urbit landscape.
Yeah.
But I'm thinking about how this relates to Urbit as sort of like a green field or an open possibility space. It very much is that. And in this space, it's so malleable that it can, you know, the tools are our own, as Hadif would say, you know, tools of our own. We can create what we want, and it's sort of like the possibilities are endless. But that also is a bit of a challenge, because, you know, sometimes you need constraints in order to actually be creative. But building a structure is also something that Dalten is doing inside of a landscape that doesn't have a lot of features right now, in more ways than one. You know, another thing biological that I've been thinking about is, if you imagine like living or life as a function with a solution, and like amoebas are a solution to how to live, like a way to be, and plants are a solution to that problem, and organisms are a solution to that problem. All these different things, all rising up from lower level processes like chemistry and cosmology and all that. And if you push this all forward, you also have similar processes happening at a societal / cultural level. The problem of culture can be has a solution in particular different contexts, that kind of thing. But if you look at the way a plant solves that problem of how to be and how to live, that's very different than the way an animal does that. And a good life for a plant doesn't mean anything to an animal, and vice versa. And in fact, they're so different in how they've solved that problem that they don't really relate in the same way anymore. But they are, interestingly enough, dependent, meaning you can't be an animal without depending on plants of some kind, right? And if you push this sort of metaphor analogy even further to sort of a cultural space, what's that solution that we might be on the cusp of that allows us to be as different as animals are to plants in the solution of like culture or society or whatever that group dynamic is? Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, I think extending that analogy maybe like, I think synthetic biology is very interesting.
Designed as well.
Yeah. Right? Yeah, exactly. And then like, I mean, I guess like, there it's kind of like, you're developing solutions for life.
On purpose.
On purpose. And also, various utilities of life, like certain organisms fit certain purposes and ecology, and sort of conscientious design of that is important and valuable. And I think like looking at it as kind of like maybe, what kind of craft or trade is sort of like playing a role here, that, I mean, could be, something that Dalton specializes in, but doesn't have to, but certainly in proximity to Dalton, like will certainly take place. It's like, like that craft of synthetic organization.
Yeah. It's like having access to cultural source code or something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, as you said, I think in the past, like structure as a service.
Yeah. But I mean, it's just trying to get your head in that space is like that's something I don't normally think about, is either social structures as having source code. It's not something I think of, but I mean, there's certainly, I mean, it's a study in and of itself, sociology. So there's something there. And I think it is possible to go about it sort of systematically or at a very deep level like that. I mean, but just sort of scratching the surface, right? So like, I'm not saying that we can, or we're even close to the point where we can just sort of start from a blank piece of paper and write out some sort of dynamic interaction between all of us and then just do it. I don't think it's quite like that, but I don't know. But what we're doing now is at least something akin to some function.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, this is like, I mean, that cabal of people that I mentioned. I mean, this was kind of became our obsession. I think I've mentioned this before, but that's what sort of drove me into like, part of what drove me into like interactive logics, game semantics, and so on. Because, I mean, it's very sort of like like the sort of like operators that you have. Yeah. Luke's quite right to sort of mention this. We've talked about it a fair bit during Urbit Happy Hour. I mean, the sort of like operators, that are in these logics, I mean, are sort of like, sort of exposing like a sort of like decision interface, and then like like moves and strategies for like making like choices across these, and these sort of like follow into like sort of like consequential, and it's like resource sensitive. So like your variables are like resources. And they can like like you can like invoke these resources that you possess and sort of like like plugging them into like other shapes or something. It's like you have like a sort of interface to maybe like create an organization. Like, what's this organization need? It needs certain things. Maybe it needs money. Maybe it needs certain types of assets. Maybe it needs certain types of people and roles. And then when people sort of like commit to these, then start to like involve, like they sort of like get like transformed into the structure that you put them in, and then it's like like I think like this for like major question here. I mean, it's kind of like sort of computational excitability, right? Because it's like you want to like the I mean a big part in sort of like being able to like measure sort of like like the maybe like the value, or maybe like more so like the effectiveness is like do it what it says. Like, can you like trust like the commitments which are made? Because like the question is whether or not like the process which was like articulated and like setting it out is faithfully executed.
And what do you think about like individual temperament in terms of following something like that, or being even engaged by like a decision interface, tree, where I'm going with this is like in my work in tech, I tend to work with a lot of people who are more analytical, who think sort of more dispassionately. I'm not saying, like, devoid of emotions or anything, but there are certain characteristics and certain traits that I tend to see in myself as well as other people that I interact with, right? And I see those traits becoming more prevalent, I think, generally speaking. So are these things being selected for, or am I on the right track here? Like what's happening, or how relevant is temperament towards organizing in this faction? Does that even make sense that I just sort of...
I know, I think that makes sense. I mean, I think that, when I was like, I I tend not to like sort of like fully endorse this sort of like hard binary of maybe, like left brain, right brain, or whatever, analytic versus creative or whatever. I think, I think you definitely have like sort of like maybe like it's not even quite like over specialization, because it's like it's not that they're separate, but it's just sort of like maybe you might say like sort of like maladaptive bias. I mean like I mean a good example of this maybe is like like one is like you just sort of like neglect the social, and it's like, oh, it's all sort of a structured computer program, technical problem to be solved. But on the other hand, it's like oh, we could like talk about like our feelings all day, and we could like stroke each other's egos, or or cry into the void collectively or something like that. But like that's equally a dead end. But I mean, I think that like, so I mean, I think like, I mean, maybe a sort of proper union of the two here would be like, like allowing like maybe like the sort of questions of temperament and emotion, sociality, and individual maybe psychological disposition or something like that, be sort of like taken up, engaged with, and like understood within analytic processes, and kind of, I mean, it's hard to say is like exactly how that works and like manifests, but like, I mean, at a very sort of simple level, it's just like, well, like some people, sort of are sort of like effective, take joy in, or sort of like more than adequate to certain tasks than others, and sort of, like, combining like some sort of joint effort is, like allowing those sorts of considerations to sort of demonstrate themselves, and like the decisions of how like roles and whatnot are distributed.
Yeah, and I think also the way we've kind of sketched out a sliding scale of sort of participation, where at some level the fully committed, and that might even become explicit in levels of like a tag on people, but the level of fully committed would have a different sort of psychology than those that are less committed, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think you're right. Yeah, and yeah, I mean, as Luke says in the chat, like, I mean, this is, I mean, I think quite true. I mean, like, different. He says that different kinds of groups will attract different kinds of temperament. So I mean, it's like kind of very multifaceted, right? Because like, at one level, it's like different groups will attract different kinds of temperament, but also like an individual group will attract different temperaments. But maybe like, what brings them there is maybe like sometimes it might be like different reasons. Those different reasons are fine, as long as it like allows people to jointly work together. But also some of them might be like similar reasons, and yet there still are like differences in terms of like what people are sort of like passionate and effective at. Yeah.
Cool. All right. Well, it's been a good conversation. Thank you very much, guys. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording here, but feel free to hang around. And then for everybody watching, we'll see you next week. And thanks for joining.